All right. So this is our virtual contracts class that we do once a month. So we're going to take a look at listing scenario and then also a sales contract scenario. So I've pulled the scenarios up. Didri, I don't know if you had a chance to print them off or not, but
I haven't printed.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll read through it and then we'll do the listing side and then we'll take a look at the sales contract side too. So, all right. So Alfred Smith calls wanting to list his home for sale. Lives at 123 Main Street, Baytown, Texas 77520, inside the city limits. The legal description: Lot 1, Block 1, Section 1 of Scrub Brush Acres. There is no HOA in the neighborhood anymore. You go and meet with him and his wife, Maggie. While walking through the home, Alfred tells you that he wants to take the curtains that are in the children's bedroom and the TV that is attached to the wall in the living room, along with the mount that's attached to the wall. The home's in good condition, should be able to accommodate any loan type. He has solar panels on the home and still owes $22,000 on those. Alfred tells you that he bought the home in 2014 and paid cash. He also mentions that he got married to his wife in 2020. They have lived there since that time, but she was never added onto the note, the deed, or any other document, and she isn't on the tax roll. So he wants to list the home starting on July the 15th. We agree to a listing through the end of October. Doesn't want it on the market until the 22nd because he has some work that he has to do first. He's fine with placing a lockbox on the property. If Alfred decides to terminate early, he'll reimburse you for your professional photography up to $400 and marketing costs up to $500 more. So he's okay with a 90-day protection period. You've agreed on a list price of $379.9. When discussing commission, you agree that he will be paying 2.5% of the sales price as HomeSmart's commission. When you discuss the possibility of paying the buyer's agent as well, he tells you that if the sales price is high enough, he would consider paying an equal amount to the buyer's agent. So another 2.5% to the buyer's agent. He also agrees that if you help an unrepresented buyer purchase, he'd pay you an additional 1%, but he does not want you personally representing both sides. All right, so we could do intermediary, but only intermediary with appointments where you would be the agent on one side and another HomeSmart agent would be the agent on the other side, but not where you would be representing both sides at the same time as a single agent. All right, so since we've done this before, and we have done it now, this is the fourth time that we've done this class. We did it at the Woodlands, we did it in Katy, and we did it in Pearland. So I've already got the documents filled out. So we're going to go ahead and go through the documents. And as we go through them, we'll talk about why it is the way it is. So we start with parties, obviously, on the listing agreement. And we have both. We have both names on the agreement. So if we go back and look at what originally he said that he bought the home in 2014, paid cash. Mentions that he got married to his wife in 2020. They've lived there since that time, but she was never added on to any document at all. She's not on the note. She's not on the deed. She's not on the deed of trust. She's not on the tax roll. Her name doesn't show up anywhere, but we still have to include her on the listing agreement. Texas is a community property state. And as a community property state, even though she doesn't show up on any document, that does not mean she doesn't have rights. She has community property rights and she has homestead rights. So community property rights just simply say that probably since the time they were married, she has started acquiring 50% of that equity from the time that they got married, and she moved into that property. Half of that equity is probably hers. Not half of it altogether, but half of it from the time they got married until today. So she's got rights and homestead rights, of course, because they were married and she lived there. She has homestead rights as well. So we can't just go with him. And a lot of times we're going to run into that. We're going to have a situation where one spouse or the other may feel like the other spouse doesn't need to join in. And they may use that as the reasoning behind that. They're not on any document anywhere. And every time I teach a class like this, I say the same thing, and I hate to do it, but I'm going to sell us guys out, because I can tell you in my 44 years of selling real estate, the only time I've ever run into this situation is where the husband said the wife doesn't need to sign. I've never had a scenario where the wife has said the husband doesn't need to sign, but I have run into it a few times where the husband has said, no, she doesn't need to be on there. So I know I'm kind of selling us out here, but that's what I've run into. Now, not to say it wouldn't happen sometimes where the wife might say it, but every time I've run into it, it's been a husband. So anyway, so we're adding both. We're adding both of them in. Alfred Smith, Maggie Smith, and of course the address of the property, 123 Main Street, Baytown, Texas, their phone number, their email. It wasn't in the scenario, so there's nothing added there. The other party, of course, to the listing agreement is the seller, and the other party is the brokerage, HomeSmart. Technically Marty, but as designated broker for the brokerage. So when we look at broker here, and it's one of those things that a lot of times agents will mess up, because when you look at the word broker, you think person, right? I mean, you think a name of an individual. And so sometimes Marty's name will show up there, but they're really after the company name. They really want HomeSmart because the agreement is technically between the seller and HomeSmart. Marty, as the designated broker, is the representative for HomeSmart, but it's really HomeSmart's listing. And so Marty, of course, as the designated broker, is the one responsible for that. But we want HomeSmart. So HomeSmart's there. And every once in a while, I'll see where an agent will go ahead and add their name afterwards. You don't really need to do that. Usually when you run into a situation like that where the agent has put their name in, it's somebody who's been an agent for a long time, because it used to be that you were required to put your name on this line in order for it to carry forward and have your name listed at the end of the document as the representative for the brokerage who's signing. You don't have to do that anymore. So HomeSmart's good enough. The address, and it really doesn't matter which office you're at. If you're at the Katy office or the Woodlands office or the Pearland office, it really doesn't matter. It's probably best to go ahead and put the main address, because if there's ever anything that comes up, any issue that comes up where we're going to be contacted by an attorney or contacted by a party or something like that, if they look at this document, that's where they're going to send information. And so even though you work out of whatever office you work out of, it's usually better if you go ahead and put the main information there. So main address, 520 Post Oak Boulevard, number 455, Houston 77027. Now, the last two lines here, phone and email. If you want to put yours, that's usually okay. Nobody's going to kick that out of compliance. If you put your own personal, your phone number and your email, that's okay. If you want to put the company's, that's fine too. Of course, our general number, 713-785-6666. And then the general email address, broker, HOU, at hsmove.com. So those are the parties. That's the way that our listing agreement should look. There's not been any change in that part. So the newest listing agreement is right here, this date right here, June 15th, 2026. That's the most recent one. And you can tell it's only a couple of months old. It's the most recent one. That's the one we're required to use. And the older ones are no longer available for use, mostly because of compensation. And when we get to that section of the listing agreement, section 5, we'll see how it has changed so much that using the old listing agreement just doesn't work. In fact, anybody who has an active listing that used the old listing agreement, they have to go and fix it. They have to go and correct it. They have to go and amend it in order to make it comply with the rules that are out there now. The part that's missing is broker to broker compensation. Up until this last version of the listing agreement, a listing broker could pay a selling broker. And it was pretty easily done. There was a place on page 10 to write in what that percentage was going to be. And then it was backed up by another document called the TXR 2402. Well, the 2402 has been retired. It is no longer available for use. There's no place on that page of the contract anymore to create broker-to-broker compensation. So the conversation with a seller has completely changed. When we get into Section 5, we'll see that. So we'll see it here in a minute. Section 2, property, all that stuff still looks pretty much the same. Our legal description of the property, and you do have to have a legal description there. Every once in a while, we'll have an agent who will just put in the street address. Well, anytime a contract contemplates a transfer of ownership, like a listing agreement or a buyer representation agreement, you must have the legal description. If you don't have the legal description, it's not a valid contract. So make sure that you have the legal description and you have it in there right. So in this case, according to our scenario, it was lot 1, block 1, section 1 of Scrub Brush Acres. And so that information is there. City of Baytown, Harris County, known as, and then on this long line here, these two lines, they only want two little things, street address and zip code. So in so many cases, they give us a line that's not long enough for everything we need. Here they gave us one that's way longer than what we actually need. And so, of course, the sale of the property is going to include everything that's in A, the land itself, B, the improvements, and C, the accessories, which typically are part of the improvements, or they are responsible for the operation of fixtures or things like that. So everything that's in A, B, and C are all included in the sale. It's always a good idea, no matter which side of the transaction we're on, always a good idea to have, in this case, the seller read through that. Yeah, I don't think you need to read it to them, but they should read through it. They should read through it because they need to understand, seller, all of these things that are B and C are required to stay. Make sure you understand that, seller, that the things that are listed in B and C are things that you cannot take with you. They are things that are required to stay. And so get them to read through that. Then after we get through that, then we can hit them with D and say, now, out of everything that's in B or C, is there anything that you would like to take with you? Because even though the contract says those things are required to stay, you have the opportunity to exclude them. You have the opportunity to say, I know these are items that would normally stay, but I want to take X thing with me. I want to take whatever item it is with me. And we would list those items. In our listing scenario, it said that they wanted to take the curtains that were in the children's bedrooms. And they also talked about the TV and the mount that was in the living room. And so this is where we run into issues sometimes, especially when we start talking about things like TV sets and things like that. Curtains in the children's bedrooms, okay, that's pretty easy. We know what those are. That's pretty good. In a situation like televisions or speakers, built-in speakers, or speakers that are hanging from a mounted system of some sort, it looks like, a lot of times it looks like it's a single unit, but it's really not. In this case, the TV itself, the monitor itself, is personal property. That would be something that the seller wouldn't really have to exclude from the sale, because it's personal property. The mount, however, the mounting system where it's mounted to a wall, that has now become a fixture. It has now become part of the real property because it's actually bolted into the wall. And so if you're going to ask for one, you probably just go ahead and ask for both. Just make sure that they understand that both of those things are going to go. The TV, you probably technically would not have to list. I always go on the side of caution. If I think there's going to be any kind of question at all, I'm going to go ahead and list it. even if it's perfectly obvious to I think everybody that this is an item that it would not be included as a fixture or an improvement or an accessory, I'm going to go ahead and list it just to be on the safe side. I would rather err on the side of caution than have a situation where we don't know. We had one situation come up today where the backyard has a pool, and they have a fence that they have for the pool, and there's a place to put the fence up. It doesn't stay up all the time, but they put it up sometimes. And so they have holes drilled in the decking where the posts go to fence off the pool when they want it fenced off. And so now we're already under contract, and now all of a sudden the agent is saying, this should be staying with the property, don't you think? Like, this is something that probably should have been addressed at the time of contract. Hopefully it's not going to be an issue. And so, of course, my response was, this is something you need to take up with the listing agent immediately. I thought they hadn't written the offer yet. And I said, why chance it? Write it in as something that's going to stay with the property, make sure that it's going to stay with the property, and make sure that it gets addressed. Well, we're already under contract. It's like, well, in that case, you probably need to contact the listing agent immediately and see if there's an issue. Maybe there's not an issue. Maybe the listing agent sees it the same way we do. Maybe not. So it's always better if we can get those things addressed at the time of contract, rather than trying to go back later on and say, hey, this is the way we saw it. Did you see it the same way? A lot of times, these types of issues are harder to get through than some of the harder issues. It's like a lot of times that they feel like they're being nickeled and dimed to death, or they feel like that you're trying to keep something you shouldn't keep, whatever. So, by the way, anytime, if you guys have any questions or anything and you want to jump in and ask any questions, please feel free just to unmute yourself if you're muted, and feel free to ask. So we're a small group, and so anytime you want to jump in, please do so. All right, so E, according to what our listing said, according to what our seller said, there is no HOA anymore. Now, when we do our contract scenario, we're going to see that that's not really true. But for what we know right now, from the information that we see right now that the seller gave us, there is no HOA, unrestricted property. That's the way that they would have described it. A lot of times a seller may think their property is unrestricted, and then we may find out later there actually are restrictions. Maybe they're not being enforced the way that they should be, but the restrictions are still in place. There is actually very little truly unrestricted property, especially around Houston and Harris County. Since there isn't any zoning in Houston, a lot of times, a lot of these subdivisions, a lot of these neighborhoods have created these deed restrictions to give them some sort of protection to keep things from happening in the neighborhood that could be detrimental to the value. So a lot of places may not have restrictions that are being enforced, but the restrictions might be still there. So, all right, moving on. Section 3, list price. $379.9. That was the price that was agreed to. This would be the only price that the listing agent would have the authority to offer the property at. So we'll see here in a little while that if the seller wants to give the agent permission to use certain language that might encourage a lower offer, then they can do that. But if the seller doesn't give that kind of permission, then we can't. We could not say, for instance, bring all offers, or seller is negotiable, or seller says sell, or anything like that that could indicate a willingness of the seller to take anything less than $379.9. Not unless the seller gives us permission to do that. If the seller gives us permission to do that, then we can. Otherwise, we can't use verbiage like that. Could be considered violation of our fiduciary duty. All right, next section, section 4, talks about term. So in our scenario, it said that, go back and take a look at it real quick. Wanted to list the home starting on July the 15th, agree to a listing through the end of October, but doesn't want to go on the market until the 22nd because they had some work to do first. All right, so technically, we're not going to be able to really offer the property for sale until the 22nd, but we want to go ahead and get it under contract to list today. They're willing to sign the listing agreement today. Let's go ahead and make the listing agreement effective today. And the reason for that is protection. Because if this seller starts doing a bunch of work on this property, getting it ready to sell, it could be that somebody may see this going on and actually stop off and say, hey, I see you're fixing up the property. What's going on? And the seller might say, I'm just getting it ready for market. And whoever it is that asked that question may have somebody interested in that property. And they might be interested in it themselves, where that buyer might say, you know, I've always admired this property. I always liked this property. I might have an interest in it myself. Well, okay, that kind of starts the conversation. But if your listing agreement's not in effect, you could get cut out. If your listing agreement is in effect here, with it being in effect, that would protect you. And so it's like, go ahead, make whatever agreement you want. I'm in the middle of this. I'm here. I'm part of it. And so give yourself some protection here, because a lot of times I have seen it actually happen. We had a seller once who really hadn't done a whole lot to their property at all. And then all of a sudden started painting on the outside, started putting in new landscaping, replaced a roof, and people started getting interested in this property. They started getting interested in what this guy was doing. And sure enough, somebody came along and said, hey, you know what? I've got a friend who I think might be interested in this house. And the deal got put together. The agent had it listed, so they were covered. And so that's a quick sale, and that's a nice one, because you probably have an agent, or you probably have a buyer that's either unrepresented or has another agent. So it goes through quickly. So in this case, our listing agreement, we said, would end on October 31st through the end of October. So now we've got listing in place from July the 15th through October 31st. You have to have an actual date in both of these. Contract law says there has to be a definite beginning date and a definite ending date. It would be great if we could have a listing that began on July the 15th, 2026 and ends at 11:59 p.m. on the day it closes. Then we'd be protected all the way through, but it doesn't work that way. It has to be a definite beginning date and a definite ending date. And by that, they mean that you can take a calendar and you can point to the day that it begins and you can point to the day that it ends. That's covered. We've got that covered here. All right, section 5, broker compensation. Here's where it has got totally different. And so old listing agreement, new listing agreement. Old listing agreement gave us two options. 5A, which would create the ability for us to charge the seller a certain amount of money and share some of that money with a buyer's agent. That is gone. You don't see it here anymore. In the old listing agreement, 5A talked about, I'm going to charge the seller 6%. I'm going to keep 3%, and I'm going to share 3% with the buyer's agent. Or we had a 5B option, which just talked about how much I'm going to charge the seller to represent the seller, and had made no mention of buyer's agent at all. That's where we are now. That old 5B section is now the only section there is to work with. But they did add in a couple of other ways to make some additional money. So let's take a look at it. So 5A, broker's fees. When earned and payable, seller will pay broker subject to all that apply, which means we can mark more than one of these boxes. Normally, they'll tell you just mark one. Only one box needs to be marked, or only one box can be marked. Not now, because they're creating additional opportunities for income. So look at what it says. Seller will pay broker. Select all that apply. Insert the amount to be paid to the broker only for services performed under this agreement. So here's how you know, going back up to parties, where broker needs to be home smart. Broker needs to be home smart because throughout this document, they talk about broker. Well, here they're talking about seller will pay broker. Seller doesn't pay Marty. Seller pays home smart. That's how you know that in section 2 of parties, a broker, they want home smart. They don't want Marty. So seller will pay broker, select all that apply. First box, a certain percentage of the sales price or a flat fee of a certain amount of money. And so in our listing scenario, it said that the seller was willing to pay us 2.5% to represent them in the transaction. But look at number 2. Number 2 is a brand new provision, never existed before, brand new. There's also an opportunity, for us to make an additional amount of money if we are working with the buyer as an unrepresented party. And we are running into that more and more and more all the time, maybe especially on leases, but we're also seeing it on sales transactions too. And why is that happening? Why all of a sudden are we seeing all these buyers who want to do this deal unrepresented? Well, it's because of the conversation that we now have to have with a buyer when we're getting them to sign a buyer rep. Remember, when the buyer rep has to be signed before we go out and show property or anything else. So that conversation with a buyer sounds something like, okay, buyer, you want me to go out and show you property, and in order for me to do that, I need to be your representative. In other words, you need to hire me. And when you hire me, that means I get paid a fee. And the fee that I'm going to be paid is X amount of dollars or X percent of the sales price. That's going to be reflected in the buyer representation agreement. So buyer, you need to be aware that at this point, this is your charge. And when we fill out this buyer representation agreement and we put 3% in there, we put 2.5% or whatever number we put in there, this is you committing to pay me that amount of money. Just like a listing agreement commits the seller to paying a certain amount of money. Buyer representation agreement does the same thing. Okay, buyer, this is committing you to pay me X amount or X percent of the sales price to be your representative in the transaction. And then, of course, we're going to try to move away from that as quickly as we can and say, however, whatever property you purchase, we're going to try to transfer that charge that you're agreeing to over to the seller. We're going to put it in the sales contract and try to get the seller to pick that up for you. Well, usually that's going to lead to the next question coming from the buyer. Well, what if the seller doesn't pay it? And so, of course, full disclosure here, full transparency, then you would be on the hook for that. And that scares some buyers away. Some buyers will come back at that point and they're going to say, you know what? I don't think I need this kind of help. I don't think I want to commit to this. Well, if you don't commit to this, I can't show you property. And so that's going to kill that relationship probably right then and there, at least for now. So what's the buyer going to do? They still want to see the property. Who are they going to call? Listing agent. They're going to call the listing agent and they're going to tell the listing agent, hey, you've got a listing I want to see. Well, now the listing agent should be asking the buyer, do you have an agent? And the buyer's going to say no. And so now here sets up the scenario where the listing agent could be working with the buyer as an unrepresented party, where the buyer would say to the listing agent, no, I don't have an agent. I don't need one. They may think they can do it themselves. They may think they're going to get enough help from the listing agent that it ends up and they end up an unrepresented buyer. And so it's because of that conversation, the way that conversation goes these days, that we're starting to see more and more and more unrepresented buyers. So that's why the second provision was added in here. If you're the listing agent and you're working with an unrepresented buyer, then of course there are certain things you have to know, which of course is you're representing the seller, not the buyer. The ability to assist that buyer is very limited. I don't represent you, buyer. There's only a few things I can do for you. I can follow your instructions. You can tell me what you want. I can pass it on to my seller. However, I don't represent you. I am not looking out for your best interest. I am not loyal to you. I will disclose the things to you that I'm required to disclose, but I'm not going to share a lot of stuff with you because my loyalty is with the other side of the transaction. And so because of that, of course, that requires that we here at HomeSmart, we have to provide that unrepresented buyer with an IABS. We have to fill out that TXR 1417, which is called the representation disclosure. We have to fill that out, showing that we are representing the seller, and make the buyer sign that. The unrepresented buyer has to sign the representation disclosure before we do anything else. It's just like the buyer rep. The buyer rep has to be signed before we show them property or anything else. Same thing here. Unrepresented buyer. Okay, you're not represented. You don't have a representation agreement. Here's the TXR 1417. You've got to sign this, which is stating that you understand that we're representing the seller and not you. That needs to be done at the beginning. And since now, hopefully, our buyer has signed that, the buyer understands that your ability to assist is there, but not to represent. But that means a whole lot more work for you. If you're working with this buyer as an unrepresented buyer, you're going to have to open doors for them every time they need to go inside the property. You're going to have to open the door for them anytime that they want the appraisal done or inspections done or anything else. You're going to have to open the door for them and all of that. So why not get some additional pay? And this is committing the seller to paying you for for working with an unrepresented buyer. Cynthia, go ahead. I think you're muted. Cynthia, did you have a question? I think you need to unmute. Let me see if maybe I can help. No, I can't unmute someone else. So you want to put, if you have a question and for some reason you can't unmute, you want to put it in chat and I'll watch the chat. Okay, Cynthia, go ahead.
I'm still muted.
I see you're muted on one, but you're in twice, but that one's not muted, so I can hear you. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can.
Okay,
Go ahead.
I'm learning. And I'm usually like camera and microphone shy, but I have a question about the compensation.
Yeah.
Let's say I convince my seller to do like 3% for me and 2% for the buyer's agent if they don't have the other agent paying the commission. And I can add on that third one a 1% if I do the whole thing, like an extra one for me if I get the buyer also. That way, if I end up doing the whole thing, I don't have to compromise the money.
So yeah, I mean, this commits you to the whole 2.5 anyway, no matter what.
I'm gonna try to go for 3, but
Sure.
I can add a 1 at the bottom line there in
Well,
case it
if,
happens. Let's
okay,
say.
so the second line here is if your buyer's unrepresented. So you're talking about, let's say that the buyer comes along, and even if they're represented, they come along in 2 weeks. And you feel like that, hey, since we took care of the seller so quickly, that maybe there should be a bonus. Then definitely you could add that in there.
Yeah.
You could add in there a $1,500 bonus if the property sells and closes within
Oh,
40
that's nice.
days.
I like that. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's what's nice about this. And I'm glad you brought this up,
Uh-huh.
because a lot of people felt like that all of this negotiation about commissions was going to create a scenario where they were going to try to pay less, that
Yeah.
parties were
Yeah.
going to try to pay less.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
honestly, since it opens the door, it really opens the door for us to create other streams of revenue as well. If I have to do
Yeah.
this, then let's get this. So
Yeah. And
Marty's mentioned that on the West Coast, that commissions have actually gone up in some cases.
I mean, I guess I hope it happens here. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's a great point, because it really opens the door to negotiate however we want, because it
Yeah.
was pretty much before X percent of the sales price, and that was it. But now it's as negotiable as it really has always been.
Yeah,
But
I saw the line and it was like I could be leaving money right there.
that's true. You do
Yeah.
have another blank here where you
Yeah.
can create
Yeah.
another way
And
to make some additional money.
and even if we have an additional 1% for the buyer's agent, if they come with the buyer's agent, we can negotiate the buyer to pay for that.
Absolutely, because at this point,
And that way we can easier get the extra money.
at
That's
this
how I
point,
saw it.
we haven't committed the seller to paying anything to the buyer's agent.
No, that's all negotiable when the offer comes in.
And
Yeah.
we'll see, and we'll
Just
see it in the
to have
sales
them
contract.
ready, that is, let's
You're
say
doing great.
2.5, 3% might be more if the buyer needs, but they're open to pay more. If the
Sure.
numbers work, we can make more.
Absolutely. Whatever the number they'll agree to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And now I need to know how to mute myself again. I have no idea. And
Well,
the screen
welcome
is
in anyway.
different now. The screen
Yeah.
is different now. I don't know why.
Yeah.
I have no clue. If I put it, I'm gonna maybe show myself, and I'm halfway done through doing my hair. So I don't want to do that. Let me see. I don't know. Keep going.
I might be able to mute you, but I wouldn't
Okay,
be. I
you can
can't
mute me.
unmute you.
You can
You
mute
want
me.
to
I
mute you?
can raise my hand if I need to. Yeah,
Okay.
mute me, please, because
Okay, there I did. Okay, I muted you. Sorry, in mid-sentence too. Sorry about that. But I can't unmute you, but I can mute you. Okay. All right. So anything that's in this box is all potential income for us working with that seller. And then down below, there's a box that this has always been part of the listing agreement for the last 2 or 3 times, but it really was not as important as it is now, where we have to see about getting permission from the seller as to whether or not we can give certain information to a buyer's agent. And that would include whether or not the seller is willing to pay. Now, we can't say anymore, we will pay you, buyer's agent, a certain amount of money, because that's not true. The seller can pay the buyer's agent directly, but not through us. So that broker to broker compensation does not exist anymore. It has to come directly from the seller to the buyer's agent. And this is going to talk about whether or not the seller gives us permission to tell the buyer's agent, yes, the seller has indicated they will pay X amount in commission. 2 options there. And one of the options has to do with whether or not we say anything at all, or if we give them a certain information. So if we mark does or does not, if we mark does, then that is saying that the seller has given us permission to say something to the buyer's agent. Now, that something could be, yeah, the seller has said they will pay up to 2.5% commission, depending on sales price. We could say that. Or we could say the seller has indicated that they would consider paying something for either buyer closing costs or buyer agent compensation, depending on sales price. So we can do that. Or we can mark this box. Oh, one other thing. If we mark this box, then that's going to require that we fill out another document called the TXR 1412, broker's authorization to disclose and advertise certain information. That's where the seller would tell us exactly what they want us to say. So if you mark does, then that's going to require you filling out another document. That's why most of the time I would recommend this one, does not. First of all, then you don't have to fill out the TXR 1412. And if the buyer's agent asks, your response would just have to be, the seller has not indicated whether or not they would be willing to do that or not. Make your offer. We'll present your offer. We'll see what happens. There's no problem with that. Buyer's agents and buyers are not shy. They're going to ask for what they want. This would not keep them from asking for what they want. So you can do either one. If you mark this one, then you're going to have to also include this other document. If you mark this one, then you don't have to fill out another document, and you are really protecting the seller more because you're saying seller has not indicated they'll do anything at this point. Send in the offer. We'll negotiate it from there. So, all right. So it talks about the other ways that income can be earned and payable. And of course, we know the difference between earned and payable. Earned is when we have a ready, willing, and able buyer in place. Payable is once they close. This transaction is not done until it closes. House is not bought, house is not sold until closing. So it is earned when a ready, willing, and able buyer shows up. It's actually payable at the time of closing. Other compensation, and this is one that's always been around too, but you don't see the listing agent taking advantage of this very often, and probably not one that we would. And it has to do with earnest money. And it talks about in the event that a transaction goes into default and falls apart. If the seller retains the buyer's earnest money, if the seller gets the buyer's earnest money, by rights, we are eligible to receive half of that money. Look at what it says. If the seller collects earnest money, that means if the deal falls apart and the seller gets earnest money, or the sales price or damages by suit, compromise, settlement, or otherwise from a buyer who breaches a contract for the sale of this property entered into during this listing, seller will pay broker after deducting the attorney's fees, collection expenses, an amount equal to the lesser of 1/2 of the amount collected after deductions, or the amount of the broker's compensation stated in paragraph 5A. So it says we could get half of the earnest money after expenses and all of that. I have never seen an agent take advantage of that. Normally, in a situation like this, where the seller has had to take earnest money because the deal fell apart, usually the seller is so mad about it anyway. If we went and tried to take half that money, we very well could lose the listing. It's just not worth it. Most of the time, it's just not worth it. Now, if you're going to lose the listing anyway, if for some reason the seller feels like that this is somehow your fault as the listing agent, if you had done a better job, then maybe might look at that. It's like, hey, this may be the last money we get out of you. You do understand that half of that earnest money after expenses is ours. But most of the time I've never seen it happen. I know it's there. I'm surprised that they haven't taken it out at some point because most agents just won't do it. Service providers, if the broker refers a seller to some certain service provider, like a cable company or an alarm company or somebody like that, then it does say that the broker may receive a fee for that. Now, we don't have any kind of relationships like that. I know there are companies out there. ADT is an example of one that I know every time that a sale takes place, that they want to try to get the contact information for that buyer or that seller and try to sell them an alarm system or sell them service, and they'll offer money to an agent to do that. Well, money like that actually has to pass through the brokerage. It cannot go directly to the agent. And so again, one of those situations where probably not worth it. 3 talked about other fees and reimbursable expenses. In our scenario, going back to our scenario, it said if they terminate early, seller said they'll reimburse you for your professional photography up to $400 and marketing costs up to $500 more. So that's where that shows up here. $400 for photography, $500 for marketing expenses if the listing is terminated early by the seller. So that would be an acceptable place to put it. You could also put it in special provisions. You could wait and negotiate that in the event that they decide they want to terminate early. When you do the TXR 1410, which is termination of the listing, you could insert it there. It could go there too. I would probably put it here just to make it clear from the very beginning that that is going to be a charge that they are going to have to pay if they terminate early. Next section talks about protection period. In this case, the protection period is 90 days. The protection period is also one of these sections that is misunderstood an awful lot. The protection period, sometimes I describe it as probably the most worthless provision in this listing agreement, because protection period just simply means that our commission, your commission as a listing agent, is only protected if the seller tries to go around us and sell directly to a buyer. If the seller, at the end of this listing agreement, if the seller lists with somebody else, then there is no protection period. And that's what it says down here in number 3. This paragraph 5E, which is the protection period, survives termination of the listing. So that means if the seller terminates early, the protection period is still in effect. This paragraph 5E will not apply, which means none of this applies if seller agrees to sell the property during the protection period and the property is exclusively listed. Sorry, get rid of that. Listed with another broker who is a member of the Texas Realtors at the time the sale is negotiated, and the seller is obligated to pay that other broker. So at the end of our listing agreement, if the seller goes and lists with somebody else, the protection period's gone. And so the only way that there's protection here is if the seller tries to do something on their own around us. So probably not going to happen. County, everything gets paid in Harris County. No matter where the property is, it is always Harris County, because this talks about where the brokerage is paid, not where the property is. So it's always Harris County because the brokerage is always in Harris County. So no matter where your property is, be sure to put Harris County in that blank. Listing services, here's where we're going to make the notation that yes, we're listing it on July the 15th, but we will not put it in the MLS or promote it for sale until the 22nd, which is 7 days later. So we would mark B, seller instructs the broker not to file this listing with one or more MLSs until 7 days before the date the listing begins for the following purpose. Seller wants to do some work before marketing to the public. So it's listed. We're protected, but we're not promoting it to the public, not yet. You could put it in coming soon, but if you put it in coming soon, you're probably going to be inundated by agents who want to show the property, and you can't do that. As long as it is in coming soon, you cannot show the property. You can't show the property. You cannot allow another agent to show the property. It can't be shown, because as soon as you show it, you now have to pull it out of coming soon and put it in active within 24 hours. So during the time that it is in coming soon, no showings. You can promote it for sale. You can say that it'll be available to show on the 22nd, but you cannot allow it to be shown otherwise. And you're going to get that call from agents all the time who try to push their way in. Well, I have a buyer who's not going to be available on the 22nd. Right now is the only time they've got available. They need to see it right now. Sorry. If you don't want to deal with that, don't put it in coming soon, because you're going to deal with that. Agents can be a pushy lot for sure. All right, next part, access to the property, authorizing access. And of course, scheduling companies, we have a couple of options. It could either be Showing Smart, which is through HAR, or it could be Showing Time or showings.com, which is Showing Time. And Showing Time, of course, is owned by Zillow. You can utilize that if you want, or you can use Showing Smart. Either one is fine. Or if you have that one certain seller who doesn't want to schedule it through anybody but you, then you would have to create a situation where every agent who wants to show has to contact you, and you have to set up the showing. It's better if you can do it through either Showing Smart or Showing Time. Key box, of course, that's the lockbox. And in our case, in our scenario, seller said, okay, you can put a lockbox on the property. And so we check that box. We check the box where, yes, there will be a lockbox placed on the property. Intermediary. So our seller said that they were okay with another agent in the company selling the property, but not you personally. So intermediary could be either one. Intermediary with appointments, 2 agents in the company, one representing the seller, one representing the buyer. That's okay. What they said they were not okay with was a single agent representing both sides. Now, again, single agent representing both sides is not the same thing as working with an unrepresented buyer. If you're working with an unrepresented buyer, you're only representing the seller. So that would not be intermediary. Make sure you understand that, because a lot of times we have, especially in our RSA platform, do not list yourself as the buyer agent if the buyer's unrepresented. Because if you list yourself as a buyer's agent, then compliance is going to say, where's your buyer rep? Show me that buyer rep. Well, you don't have one. Make sure that if your buyer is unrepresented in RSA, when you create the transaction, put that the buyer is unrepresented. That way they won't ask for any of that stuff that you don't have.
Excuse me, Don. I have a
Yeah,
quick
sure.
question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir. What are some of the reasons that that the seller would not want a lockbox put on?
They, if they want it, it's kind of the good with the bad. If you put a lockbox on, of course, that's going to open it up to 46,000 real estate agents who are all members of HAR who now have access to the property. Well, by virtue of putting it in the MLS, that's what that's all about. Putting it in the MLS makes it available to those 46,000 agents. If they wouldn't want a lockbox, it's because they want to try to control who's coming into the property. Okay. But if they're going to do that, they're trying to get the best of both worlds. They want the exposure that they get in MLS, but they're trying to control or have somebody control who is going into that property. And so most likely, if there is no lockbox on the property, then that's either going to mean that they're going to have to be there all the time, or they're going to expect you to be there all the time. They're going to expect you to accompany in order to let them in, or they're going to have to be there. And so really the objection handler to that is to tell that seller, it's really better if you're not here when that house is shown.
Okay.
Because if you're here, buyer's not going to feel comfortable, agent's not going to feel comfortable, and they're probably going to get out of here a lot quicker than they would have otherwise. You need to let them have free reign. You need to let them have the ability to walk through at their leisure, see what they want to see. And I understand you have personal property that you probably don't want them to see. Well, then that's what the listing agreement talks about, is that you need to do something with that property. Get it out of anything that they might be looking in. You know, if you have a closet, and in that closet you have a built-in dresser, they're going to be opening those drawers because that's going to stay. They should not be opening any freestanding dresser or freestanding chest of drawers. They have no reason to be in there. So, you know, put your stuff in a place where they have no reason to be in. And of course, if you want, you can always have cameras in place. You can do whatever you want to be able to monitor what's going on. You can't record, you can't listen to audio, but you can monitor video. Those are the rules.
Okay.
But yeah, usually it's a seller who really just doesn't understand that it's better for them to not be there. They think it's better to be there because they think, well, I'll have control over what they see, what they don't see.
Oh, wow.
They're probably hurting themselves.
I agree.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Good question. Good question. All right. So our two options: intermediary status, no intermediary. If the seller says, nope, I don't want this intermediary thing at all. I've heard about it. I don't like it. I just don't want it. They need to understand what that truly means. If we mark no intermediary status at all, then that means that HomeSmart, who has 2,000 agents in Houston, in the Houston area, that none of those agents would be able to show your property for sale. None of them would be able to show your property for sale because they will have a buyer representation agreement before they go out and show property at all. And by virtue of the fact that I have a listing agreement with you, another agent in the office has a buyer representation agreement with the buyer, that's intermediary. So if you don't allow that, basically what you're saying is that out of those 46,000 real estate agents who all belong to the Houston Association of Realtors, you're cutting out 2,000 of them from ever showing your property. And it's the 2,000 that work for us. It's not a good idea. We can do intermediary with appointments that requires 2 agents. We just won't do intermediary without appointments that allows a single agent to do both sides. So we don't want to cut it out completely. We just want to minimize what type of intermediary can be done. All right, section 10, confidential information. Confidential information remains confidential forever. This is to assure that seller that anything that you tell me confidentially will not be passed on to a buyer unless it happens to be something that we're required to disclose by law. And that would have to do with condition of property, things like that. If the seller didn't want you to disclose that they're in the middle of a divorce, fine. That has no bearing on the buyer. We will not disclose that. If the seller says, I'm 90 days behind on my monthly payment, and the lender has told me that if I don't get this under contract to sell in the next 30 days, they're going to foreclose. I don't want a buyer to know that. No problem. We won't be telling that either. All that's confidential information. It has no bearing on what the buyer is doing. We won't tell. But If you're going to tell me my house has a cracked slab and I don't want that disclosed to the buyer, I'm telling you that confidentially, no way. Sorry. The law requires we disclose any known defects about a property. We cannot withhold that information. That would violate every rule that we're required to follow. It would violate what you're supposed to be doing. It would violate Texas law, which is a disclosure state. So it would get you in trouble. It'd get me in trouble. No. And if the seller insists and says, well, I don't really think there's anything wrong with the slab anyway, forget I said it. Sorry, you've already said it. So that's something. And if you refuse to allow us to disclose it to the other side, then you can take your listing somewhere else.
Don, what about if a person passed away in the house?
Good question. And it depends on what did they pass away from. So the rule says, and it's in our seller disclosure too, that the only types of death we do not have to disclose. And that's the way the rule reads. The rule says there's 3 types of death that do not have to be disclosed: natural causes, suicide, or an accident not related to the condition of the property. Those are the 3 that do not have to be disclosed. Everything else has to be disclosed. So it depends on what the cause of death was. So if it was natural causes, then no, you don't have to disclose that. If it was suicide, you don't have to disclose that either. If it was an accidental drug overdose and they died in the property, you don't have to disclose that either. But if somebody drowned in a pool, you would have to disclose that because it is related to the condition of the property. It is related to the fact that the property has a pool.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
It's a great question. It's kind of a fine line. So we have to kind of, as a listing agent, this is where sometimes it can kind of create a bit of an ethical dilemma, you know? As a listing agent, I have to think about who that buyer is going to be. And sometimes as a listing agent, I put myself in the shoes of that buyer. And I'm thinking, if I was buying this property, let's say I knew that somebody committed suicide in the property. And I know me and I know how I feel about it. And I know that if I were the buyer, I would want to know. But the seller says, absolutely not. I do not want that disclosed. Well, that's a lawful instruction that as a listing agent, I would have to follow. But yet, from an ethical standpoint, I might feel a moral obligation that buyer should know. That if the buyer cares enough to ask the question, they're asking the question for some reason. And most likely the reason is because they don't want to live in a house where somebody has died. They probably don't care how they died. They just don't want to live in a house where that has occurred. But as a listing agent, I would not be able to disclose that information to the other side. So let's say the buyer asks the buyer's agent, can you find out if there has been any type of death in this property? I see the seller disclosure that says there's not been any type of death other than natural causes, suicide, or an accident related to the condition of the property. But I want to know if there's been any type of death at all. And that's what I'm concerned about. So the buyer's agent says, well, I don't know. Let me see what I can find out. So they contact the listing agent. That's us. And so I know my agency relationship with the seller has said, I can't tell. I'm not allowed to tell. But yet I've got a buyer's agent who's asking me for the answer to that question. And so that's a fine line that we have to walk because we owe honesty to everybody. But my fiduciary responsibility to the seller is going to not override that, but it's going to come into play. So buyer's agent asks me, hey, my buyer wants to know, has there been any type of death on this property at all? They see the seller disclosure, but what about these other 3? What about natural causes, suicide, or an accident not related to the condition of the property? My buyer just doesn't want to live in a house where there's been any type of death at all. So they want to know, has there been any type of death at all? Well, I can't say no. That's a lie. I can't say I don't know. That's a lie. As a listing agent, the only way I can really answer that question, will probably answer the question, but it is, I'm sorry, my client has not given me permission to answer that question. Now I probably, and that's true. That's the truth.
Mhm.
So I have fulfilled all my obligations. I fulfilled my fiduciary agency responsibility to my seller. I fulfilled my agency requirements to the other side, who are customers, and I have to be honest with them. So I have fulfilled everything. I probably answered the question by saying it, but I just did it the right way.
Mhm.
Fine line.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
I know, you're right, right?
Woo.
It's
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's a major dilemma. Oh wow.
And so if I, as a listing agent, if I feel like if somebody wants to know badly enough, I feel like they have the right to know, and my seller just absolutely says no, that might be a listing that I can't take. It depends on how strong are my morals and my ethics at that point. Am I willing to go ahead and follow the instructions of the seller and hope that the buyer can figure it out based on the information that I provide? Or am I in a situation where I might tell the seller, hey, look, I get you. I understand where you're coming from, but I just don't think I can take this listing, because to me, if a buyer wants to know badly enough to ask, I feel like they should have the right to know. But if I can't tell them, then I think you probably need to find a different listing agent.
Mhm.
It just depends on how strong is that pull on the moral
Mhm.
side.
Yes.
Yeah. Great question, because
Oh,
it always
oh,
spurs
thank you.
that conversation. Yeah. Good question.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. So broker authority, number 11. Broker authority, of course, talks about the authority that the seller is providing us. Agency relationship is all about the principal granting authority to the agent. And so this is the authority that they grant us. And this is the authority that we now have. Seller gives the broker the authority to use reasonable efforts to act diligently to market the property for sale, procure a buyer, and negotiate the sale. So they kind of leave it wide open. That term, reasonable effort and act diligently, kind of leaves the door wide open to whatever we feel like the correct way or the best way to market that property would be. And they give us the authority to display the listing on the internet with a couple of possible exceptions. If the seller doesn't want the address to be on the property or on the internet, or the listing to be on the internet at all, then of course they're probably really diminishing their ability to get that property sold. So we hardly ever see these marked. And then the type of financing that we can say would be available for this property. Typically conventional VA, FHA, probably going to be there. If the property is too expensive, say 900,000 or something like that, FHA may not be a viable way to finance because of the upper limit of an FHA loan, which is about 560,000. So at 900,000, unless they're putting 300,000 or 400,000 down, FHA is probably not going to be an available way to promote this property financially. Cash always works. Texas Veteran Land Program typically will work too. It can be used in conjunction with any of these three types of loans. So if any of these three types of loans can be used, most likely the Texas Veteran Land Program can also be used. The other authorities that are given, those are all listed here. 12 has to do with seller representations, the representations that the seller makes. A very common mistake that we see are these items not being answered. You must answer these questions. And leaving them blank, a lot of times the agent will say, well, I left them blank because they don't apply. Well, leaving them blank is not answering them. It's not the same as none or NA. The only thing that's the same as none or NA is none or NA. Leaving it blank is a non-answer. It's just saying that I'm not answering that question. And they need to be answered, especially E and F. Because E and F talks about whether or not the seller is behind. Are they delinquent on any loan that pertains to this property? If they're not, they're not. F, are they aware of any other liens on the property? And in this case, we had a solar panel lien, so we would have to mark that. We'd have to list that. We said that they still owed $22,000 on the solar panel, so we would want to mark that. I wants to know if there's any relocation company involved in the transaction. Typically not. The reason they ask that question is because in a lot of cases, if you're dealing with a seller who has a relocation company, then at some point in time, the seller may actually end up selling that property to the relocation company, and we no longer are dealing with the seller anymore. We are now dealing with the relocation company. And of course, if that happens, then the relocation company has the ability to take this listing away and go list with somebody else. And so that's why we're asking the question here, are you involved with a relocation company? Because if so, then we have to understand that our listing agreement is subject to be canceled if they go ahead and sell that property to a relocation company. So that's why they asked that one. Kay wants to know if the property is inside a water district. Well, in our scenario, it said it was inside the Baytown city limits. So the answer to that question is no, it's not. It's not inside a water district because it's inside the city limits. Typically, if you're inside the city limits and you get your water from the city, you're not in a water district. Water districts are where the property is not inside a city limits normally. Always exceptions, but that's normally. 13, seller's additional promises. Talks about the fact that they will facilitate the showing, marketing, and selling of the property. That's the agreement by putting it in MLS. It's telling the seller, hey, not only are we going to be showing your property, by putting it in MLS, you get all this additional exposure. It's going to open up your information about your property to 46,000 other real estate agents in the Houston area. By doing that, you're agreeing to allow them to show your property as well. If you don't want that, then probably shouldn't put it in MLS, which of course is not going to be a good idea if they really want to sell it. They won't rent or lease the property during the time of the listing because of course we know that a lease would survive the sale. If they lease the property out, that's going to greatly diminish our ability to sell the property, especially to an owner occupant, just because the lease would survive the sale. So all those things that are there. Limitation of liability creates protection for us. It says we are not going to be responsible for all these things. And they even bold it out. They make it bold to where the seller understands we're not property managers. It's not our responsibility to go and take care. If your house is vacant, it's not our job to go and take care of your water pipes. It's not our job to go and make sure that the pipes don't freeze and break. That's not us. That's property management. That's not us. And you don't want to take that responsibility because if they do freeze and break, then you're in trouble. Special provisions, not usually anything there that we need to add in. Default just talks about if either we or the seller breach the agreement, what's going to happen there. And 17, that we would mediate that in the event that there is some kind of breach of the agreement on either side, that we would agree to mediate that before litigate. Attorney's fees just simply says who would be responsible, whoever, if for some reason that's ever got litigated, that whoever lost the court case would be responsible for paying all the attorney's fees for both sides. And then 19, the other addenda that would be attached to this listing agreement. So IABS, obviously, seller disclosure, obviously. Rest of these may or may not, depending on the situation. Just depends on what we've got going on. Agreement of the parties and additional notices, just more protection for us, telling them that we're not inspectors, that we're not engineers, that we are not required to know about condition of property. We are required to disclose what we find out and what we know, but it's not our responsibility to actually discover those things. And this one is one that gets missed a lot because it's kind of buried. 21H, we do need to confirm whether or not our seller is a foreign person. And of course, the reason why, it could have a huge effect on their proceeds. If they are not a foreign person, then no money will be withheld. But if they are considered a foreign person, as far in the eyes of the IRS, then a certain amount of their proceeds are going to be withheld by the title company. And that can be up to 15% of whatever the sales price of the property is. So that could be a substantial amount of money. Signatures. Broker's printed name should always be HomeSmart. Don't put Marty's name. Again, it's like, I know it sounds like a person, but it is not. HomeSmart. And then, of course, HomeSmart's license number, which is 544462. You can put in the -BB if you want, but you don't have to. Trek says that only under certain circumstances do you have to add in the letters. So this is not one of them. On this line would go your signature. You would mark yourself as the broker's associate. Even though you're not a broker, you are the associated with the broker. And so you would mark this box here. Your signature would go there. Your name would go here. Your license number would go here. And again, you can put in your -SA if you want, or not. You don't have to. Either way. All right, that's our listing agreement. Using that scenario, that's our listing agreement. So what time we got? So it's right at 7 o'clock, or very close to 7 o'clock. So I'm going to take a 5-minute break and get the next document up that we need to take a look at, which is the sales contract. And then we can get back together here in, let's say, 5 minutes at 7 o'clock. Let's get back together, and then we'll go through the sales contract based on the way our scenario reads. So just give me 5 minutes to get all this stuff moved around, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to stop recording for just a second. I just want to pause it. I don't want to stop it. Man, I don't think it's going to let me pause.